Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Kat Del Grosso. I work at College Ave Student Loans. I am also I'm representing as a co-chair of the Financial Wellness Education Committee of MASFAA, and my co-chair is on the call as well, Sarah Bergeron from Assumption University. We're kind of co-sponsoring this also with the Professional Development and Training Committee at MASFAA as well, or otherwise known as PD&T, because we love acronyms around here in financial aid. I am pleased to bring to you today, all of us bring to you today, the ins and outs of 529 plans. And so some of you out there may recognize Jonathan Sparling. And he also has a colleague with him today, Joann Dashiell. Did I say that right? Joann.
Dashiell. You were very close.
Okay. So let me just do a quick intro of Joann and Jonathan. Joann is the Chief Marketing Officer at College Well, the private college 529 plan. And she's responsible for all marketing efforts across multiple audiences and channels for College Well. And she has 15 years of higher ed experience and loves helping families and students make their college dreams an affordable reality. Prior to joining, she started in higher ed in 2001, and prior to joining TPC, Joann held various roles at MASFAA, ASA, and most recently served as executive director of the Higher Education Assistance Group, or HEAG, where she was in charge of business operations, sales, and marketing. Jonathan Sparling was or is currently the director of strategic partnerships at College Well, Private College 529, and in his role, he's responsible for developing and enhancing partnerships that elevate the Private College 529 brand and support strategic growth initiatives. Jonathan started his career in working in financial aid at WPI, and during his time there and throughout his career, he's always counseled students and families on college planning, savings, financing, and general financial education. So this is obviously a perfect role for him. That's my commentary. Prior to joining PC 529, Private College 529, he was associate director at MASFAA, and he holds an accredited financial counselor AFC designation through the Association for Financial Counseling, Planning, and Education, or AFCPE. So we've got great speakers for you guys today, and we're really happy that you're joining us so we can learn and make it easier to talk with families about the 529. So all right, so without further ado, Jonathan or Joann, I don't know which of you will be starting, but if you guys want to go ahead and share your screen, you should be all set to do that.
All right. Well, Kat, thank you so much for the introduction. And Joann and I are very excited to be speaking with all of you today about the ins and outs of 529 plans. It's great to see some familiar names on the webinar here today. Both Joann and I, throughout our careers, have been involved with MASFAA in different capacities. But it's exciting to kind of see folks here and, kind of come and learn about a topic that we believe is really important for families to know about and for all of your families to know about. And so we're excited to talk about the ins and outs of 529 plans. And again, thank you to the MASFAA Financial Wellness Committee for allowing us to join you today and speak about some of these things. So Joann and I are going to kind of tag team this presentation. I'm going to kick us off with a little bit of the history of 529 plans. We won't go too deep into the history because that would be an entire presentation, but we'll kind of give you the brief overview. Then we'll spend some time talking about the two major types of 529 plans, savings and prepaids. And then I'll turn it over to Joann. She's going to talk about the impact of 529s on financial aid, obviously something that is very important to all of you, kind of in the roles that you play. And then she'll also talk about changes ahead and what we can expect from 529s moving forward, and then we'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end. Like to have some learning objectives. I think that's very important. So hopefully all of you will walk away with a better understanding of the major components of 529 savings and prepaid plans. You'll be able to explain the primary benefits of both types of plans, and you'll be able to communicate the impact of 529 plans on financial aid eligibility. So before we jump in, just a little bit more about who we are and who we represent. Kat was mentioning College Well and Private College 529 plan. So College Well is it's a new brand for us. That's our new consumer education brand. It's been live in market since last April. And for our entire existence, we've been known as Private College 529 plan. And so we really created College Well as a way to bring more folks into the fold, to provide education to consumers around college saving and paying. And the way that we do this is that we bring in experts from our member colleges, those that are part of Private College 529 plan, to speak on topics related to financial aid, paying the bill, understanding financial aid, things like that. And then we also partner with financial advisors to provide some content to both general consumers as well as our account owners. And so hopefully you've been seeing a little bit about College Well out there, and definitely encourage you to check out the site. And so if you think about College Well as the education portion, Private College 529 plan is really our savings plan. And so Private College 529 is a prepaid 529 plan. What makes us a bit unique is that we are not tied to any one state. We're national in scope, and we work with about 300 private colleges across the US. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the prepaid side. All right, so let's start with, so today is all about the ins and outs of 529 plans. So let's start with kind of a high level overview of the history of 529 plans. And really, these plans were established, and the thought behind these kind of came from, in the 80s, kind of high inflationary times that were impacting Americans. And certainly that was trickling down to higher education, where colleges were seeing significant tuition increases, or really families were seeing significant tuition increases on the cost of college. And so the first plan was actually established in Michigan in 1986, called the Michigan Education Trust. And the first plan was actually a prepaid plan. And so basically, Michigan residents were able to prepay for the cost of in-state tuition and fees in the state of Michigan. And so that was in 1986. And, these plans and kind of the benefit to consumers was really kind of recognized across the board. And so other states started to establish these plans, some similar in terms of prepaid, which allows you to kind of, again, pay now for future expenses. Others were more structured, like investment plans. We'll talk about what those are and the major differences. But all, so states started to have these plans, and there was some real momentum. And then officially, the plans themselves, 529s, were established in 1996 in the Internal Revenue Code 529. And so that's kind of how the 529 stuck. And so, when we talk about 529 plans, really they were established as tax advantage savings plans designed to encourage families to save for future education costs. Now they are officially known, or legally known, as qualified tuition plans. And the plans themselves, there's certain stipulations within the code, but one of the most important things to know is that these are sponsored by states, state agencies, or educational institutions, and again are authorized by Section 529 of the Internal Revenue Code. When it comes to kind of the types of 529 plans, really there's two basic types. You have your 529 college savings plans, or sometimes called investment plans because you're choosing investment options, and 529 prepaid tuition plans, or these are sometimes called just prepaid plans. And 529 plans themselves, as I said earlier, they were really established to help families save for future education costs. And really the way that they were designed and kind of structured is that they are used to save for and pay for what's defined as qualified higher education expenses. And so when we talk about those qualified higher education expenses, or QHEEs, sometimes shortened, also known as QEEs, because there's been some changes to what qualifies, and we'll talk about that later. But really, for those qualified higher education expenses, what families are saving for in these plans is to save for tuition, mandatory fees, and the cost of textbooks, supplies, and equipment required for the enrollment or attendance of the beneficiary, so their student in question. Qualified higher education expenses also include special needs services in the case of special needs beneficiary, computers, peripheral equipment, software, and integrated services and related service, and also can cover room and board during the academic period in which the beneficiary is enrolled at least half-time in a degree or certificate program. So as you can see, and all of you know this, these are most of the major expenses a family would be obligated to pay when it comes to a higher education expense. And so these are, again, these plans established to save for these qualified higher education expenses. And so, we talked about the kind of the reason for these plans and why they were established in the first place, really to incentivize families to save, to help them kind of get ahead when it comes to saving for college in kind of the high inflationary times. But in terms of the structure of them and the primary benefits and features, they really are some incredible savings plans when you think about them, really in comparison to other ways families might save for college, or really just kind of any plans that you might have saving for anything. So one of the primary benefits of 529 plans are taxes. So 529 plans, contributions are made with post-tax dollars. This is similar to a Roth IRA. So there's no federal income tax deduction for contributions to your 529 plan. However, once those contributions are made, 529 funds grow tax deferred, and withdrawals are tax-free if used to pay for the aforementioned qualified higher education expenses. In addition to that, although there's no federal income tax deduction, individual states may offer credit or deductions for contributions for your state income taxes. And so there's a possibility that an individual contributing to 529s could really have a triple tax advantage, right? So the funds are growing tax deferred, the withdrawals are tax-free as long as they're used to pay for qualified higher education expenses, and individual states may offer a tax credit or deduction for contributions. Now, on that state side, each state's going to vary a little bit. So most states will say, hey, we're only going to give you the credit or deduction if you contribute to our plan, or the plan in question. So you're a resident of Pennsylvania and you're, or resident of X state and you're contributing to that plan. Some states offer what's called tax parity. And so it doesn't matter what 529 plan you contribute to, they're going to give you, there's about 7 states that offer that. They're going to give you the option or the opportunity to claim a deduction or credit. And really kind of the range of this is it's going to vary across states. So some will have no tax deduction or credits. Some will be in the kind of $1,000, $2,000 range. So in Massachusetts, single filers can claim up to $1,000 state income tax deduction, or $2,000 for married filing jointly, or joint filers. And then some states are really knocking it out of the park. So in Pennsylvania, for example, this is one of the most generous ones. So taxpayers in Pennsylvania, if they contribute to their Pennsylvania 529 plan, they can get up to a $16,000. So single filers, $16,000 per year per beneficiary state income tax deduction, or $32,000 for filing jointly. Now, certainly you would have to contribute that amount, but still, just to give you an idea, that's kind of on one wide range or one end of the spectrum. So really kind of the takeaway primary benefit with 529s are those tax advantages. Another primary benefit of these plans comes to the beneficiary. So most of these accounts, most 529s are established by the parent or perhaps the grandparent. They're called the account owner. And they will identify a beneficiary to save for. Now, that beneficiary can be changed to another eligible family member at any time. And so if that beneficiary decides not to go to college, or if another situation happens, that account owner retains control and they can change that beneficiary, which is which is pretty good for the account owner opening that. There's also flexibility when it comes to use of funds. So a portion of funds can be used for K-12 expenses and student loan repayment. And this is some new legislation that came to being, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later on, but just kind of flexibility across the board. When it comes to contribution limits, so lifetime contribution limits are generous, and they're going to be set by each state's plan. So there's going to be a, generally speaking, a range of $200,000 to $550,000, with most kind of in the $4,000 max range. So kind of big contribution limits, or high contribution limits. And then there's also, we talked about kind of taxes on the growth and state income tax, but there's also gift tax advantages. So 529 plan contributions are considered completed gifts and qualify for the annual gift tax exemption, which is $16,000, and this year $16,000 per single filer, up to $32,000 for filing jointly. So some real big benefits when it comes to 529 plans, and one of the reasons they remain an attractive option for families saving for college. And so, just kind of where we stand and by the numbers, Joann and I just attended a 529 conference. I know you were all jealous, but it was actually really good. It provided a lot of really good information about the state of the industry. It's always good to kind of learn about how states are approaching kind of marketing and outreach, and then how they're kind of trying to attract more savers. But in terms of where we are with the numbers kind of industry-wide, so as of June 30th, total assets of about $413 billion in 529 plans. This is both in savings and prepaid. About almost 16 million accounts. You can see that average account balance of almost 26,000, and 38% of accounts set up for automatic contributions, which, financial wellness, kind of that auto contributions and kind of set it and forget is a really important, especially when it comes to establishing some good savings behaviors. All right, so let's move into talking about the two major types of 529 plans, 529 savings and prepaid plans. So 529 college savings plans, as the name implies, they're savings plans designed to help families save for all college expenses, including tuition, fees, room, board, etc. Although they're called savings plan, they're structured more like investment plans. And so when families open an account, they're choosing how their money is invested, similar to retirement accounts. Now, many 529 plans will have different glide paths or kind of structured investments that you can choose that might be a little more, riskier as the child is younger, and then get a little more conservative as they get closer to college. But each state kind of has their established investment options within their plan, and folks are able to choose kind of where they want their money to go. And plans are sponsored by a state entity, and many do not have a residency requirement. So right here in Massachusetts, obviously the state entity that sponsors is MASFAA, and the program is managed by Fidelity. Plans are either direct sold or advisor/broker sold. So kind of the major difference here is that direct sold plans are kind of anyone can go out and open a plan. You go out, you establish, you say, I want to open this account, I'm saving for this beneficiary, and you can start contributing funds. Advisor broker sold plans, those are a little more structured. They're going to come right from a financial advisor or broker. And so that's kind of just kind of the major difference there. Most plans are advisor sold, back when, in the early 2000s, more plans were broker or advisor sold. And the trend recently has definitely been to more direct sold plans. When it comes to 529 plans, almost every state, so 49 states and the District of Columbia, offer a 529 college savings plan, the only exception being Wyoming. And so I included a link right there that brings you to Saving for College, which is a good site to kind of show you all of the different 529 savings plans by state. And again, there's going to be some similarities between each. There's going to be some differences just in terms of kind of how they're structured and how they're set up. And as I mentioned, most do not have a state residency requirement on the savings side. And so if families kind of research and they say, what would be the best for me? And they can choose to open a plan. So those are the 529 savings or investment plans. On the other side are prepaid plans. And so as I mentioned earlier, Private College 529 falls under this bucket, the prepaid plans. Now with prepaid plans, what prepaid plans allow families to do is to prepay all or part of college expenses, as the name implied. Most prepaid plans are limited to prepaying for tuition and fees only. So it's going to be a little bit different than, in 529 savings plans, you're kind of saving for all those expenses. Most prepaid plans are limited to prepaying for tuition and fees only. Now you could certainly take out those funds to pay for other room and board expenses. But again, in terms of the savings vehicle, most of them are allowing you to prepay at today's rate for tuition and fees only. The way that prepaid plans are structured are really two types within kind of a subset of prepaid: contract plans or unit plans. So contributions in unit plans, they purchase tuition credits or units to be used in the future. And so again, you're kind of locking in a certain amount here to be used in the future. Or families can enter a contract to buy a set number of years, so 1, 2, 4 of future tuition. So Florida Prepaid is one of the kind of the bigger ones in the country that acts more like a contract plan, whereas Private College 529 would be more of a kind of a unit. Unlike 529 savings plans, most prepaid plans do have a state residency requirement. This is where either the beneficiary or the account owner would have to be a resident of the state in order either one or perhaps both would have to be a resident of the state to open a plan. Exception to this is the Massachusetts U plan, as well as Private College 529 plan. And another big difference with prepaids is that there's just not too many of them anymore. And so 9 states, I listed them there, and the Private College 529 plan are accepting new applicants. And so the kind of more, when people talk about 529s, they're usually referring to those savings or investment plans, but prepaid plans are really a good option for families that are looking to, mitigate risk. They're looking to kind of diversify their college savings portfolio. And I should also mention that you can have multiple plans. And so you do not need to choose one or the other. And so here's just a list of prepaid plans by state. I included all of these because there's less of them, whereas on the savings plan, just kind of gave you the direct link there. So just a little bit more about Private College 529 plan. Now I think it's a good time to mention. So as I mentioned earlier, Private College 529 is a prepaid tuition plan. It allows families to lock in the current rates to save on future tuition. We work with nearly 300 private colleges and universities nationwide, all in one plan. And families' prepaid tuition is guaranteed by participating schools for up to 30 years. And so again, what makes our plan a bit unique in the space is that we're not tied to any one state. We're actually owned and operated by our member institutions, almost 300 strong. The families are locking in the current rate, again, and their return or their growth is tied to whatever the tuition increase goes up. By the very nature of opening an account, they're saving every school in the plan and any that join in the future. And you can see no fees, market risk is minimal. And again, it's guaranteed by participating schools. So for anyone on the call, if you work at a private institution and you're not already with us, Joann and I would be happy to speak with you about how you can join our growing list of schools. So that I will end the pitch there, but a unique savings plan for families. So just a little bit more here before I turn it over to Joann. When we kind of a comparison, and certainly there's other similarities and differences, but kind of the big ones here, the similarities between the two plans: contributions in both plans are made with after-tax dollars, as I mentioned. You're going to experience, or families experience, tax-free growth, tax-free withdrawals if used on qualified expenses, no account owner income limits, and so your account owners are not being phased out based on how much they earn. And then it is considered a parental asset in the financial aid formula, which Joann will talk about. The differences, and really kind of when I say differences, this is kind of, prepaid plans versus savings plans. So with prepaid plans, you're locking in that rate versus a market investment for savings plans. And so, pros and cons with that. Certainly kind of locking in is an advantage in kind of turbulent times. And so again, kind of that balanced approach many families are looking. As I mentioned, most come with a state residency requirement, either of the account owner and the beneficiary. That's on the prepaid side. Many plans have an enrollment period that's on the prepaid side. So there's going to be a certain amount of time within the year where you can enroll, a certain number of months. Families can open an account and enroll. So that's, just something to be aware of. And again, not offered in every state on the prepaid side, or I guess on the savings side, every state but Wyoming. And so finally, just some major FAQs that we typically hear. Do I have to choose my own state's plan? Meaning if I live in, Utah, do I have to choose the plan? You don't. However, doing so may result in a potential state tax deduction or credit. So again, most of those states are only offering that deduction or credit if you're contributing to that state's plan, to your home state's plan, except for those with that tax parity. Do all states offer income tax deduction credits? So the answer is no. And even for those that do, it's going to vary widely. We talked about, are there federal tax deductions or credits available? The answer is no, since contributions are made with post-tax dollars. There are not any federal tax deductions or credits for 529 contributions. So what happens if I don't use, or the family doesn't use, unqualified educational expenses? So if you withdraw the money from a 529 and do not use for an eligible college expense, it's going to generally be subject to both federal income taxes and a 10% penalty on earnings in the account. So just something to be aware of. Now, again, as we mentioned earlier, a lot of flexibility with 529s. So even if you oversaved, good problem to have, you could kind of fund the first student and maybe change the beneficiary for another student, or who you can change it to includes outside the nuclear family as well. There's kind of a list of folks that could go to. And then finally, are there fees? So that's really going to depend. Each state sets their own fee structure. But if there are fees, they are typically minimal. And, states have done a really good job to kind of incentivize this. And so, 529s just continue to be really, really attractive. And if you think about, the potential impact of families being able to save, mitigate what they're paying out of pocket, and then also mitigate what they're borrowing, just a really, really powerful tool. So with that, I'm going to stop and I'm going to turn it over to Joann, and she's going to take us through 529s, talking about financial aid and some of the recent changes in legislation that have come with 529s.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jonathan. So I'm going to start by talking about how we report 529 accounts on the FAFSA, and then we'll get into the impact that they have on the expected family contribution, at least how it works today, and hopefully will help you as you're answering questions from families. You may get questions, or you may hear statements. I'm sure everyone on the phone has heard that, don't save for college because it's going to negatively impact your financial aid, right? We've all heard it. And hopefully, you have your own sort of talking point that you say to help families really understand how this works. And if you don't have that down pat yet, we'll make sure that we give you one, give you that information here today so you can help spread the word. So we'll first talk about how 529 plans are reported on the FAFSA, and we're going to specifically talk about the FAFSA today and federal methodology as it relates to the 23-24 academic year. So we're not going to talk a lot about IM, but I will just say in general that 529 plans, like other investments, are treated favorably in institutional methodology as well. Then we'll get into when it comes time to use your 529 funds, right? You've been saving for years and now it's time to use that. We'll talk about some really important tax implications in terms of spending down that account. And then, as Jonathan mentioned previously, we'll talk about some of the changes that have recently happened to expand plan usage, and then some other things that are to come down the road, which I'm sure most of you are all digging into when it comes to the FAFSA Simplification Act and some other ways. And we're going to focus on one specific change that's coming down the road related to 529 plans. So getting started with how we begin to report 529s on the FAFSA. So like other investments, they are treated as an asset on the FAFSA. And in most cases, we're talking about dependent students here, right? Dependent students are not owning their own 529 accounts, but if they do happen to be the account owner of a 529 plan for some reason, if they are considered a dependent student, it's treated as a parental asset regardless. For independent students, and this happens less frequently, but for independent students who also own their own plan, so they're the account owner, then it would be treated as a student investment and a student asset. So most of us here know the benefit of having a 529 account treated as an asset and instead of income, right? Specifically related to parents, the most that a 529 plan or any investment is going to be impacted or impact the expected family contribution would be 5.64% of that total asset. So treated very favorably compared to parent income, which is assessed at a 22 to 47% range, right? And so for this reason alone, this is why we want to say, hey, parents, look, yes, you do have to report this information, the total amount of these assets on the FAFSA. But it's not a one-to-one rate as parents may think, right? They may think if I have $10,000 in a savings account or a 529 account, the college is going to expect me to write a check for that and hand that over. And that's just not the case at all. If a parent has multiple 529 accounts, they do have to report, they have to add those up, and they do have to report the total amount of those 529 accounts as an asset on the FAFSA. If you own a 529 prepaid plan, it's a little bit different. With a 529 savings account, you of course report the market value of that 529 account as the asset. But with prepaid plans, it would be the refund value of that. So if you were to withdraw that money, the refund value of that is what you would report in the FAFSA. With private college 529, when you log into your account, we call that the FAFSA value to make it really clear. This is the number that you report on your FAFSA. And we also educate families, making sure they know they have to include all of the accounts that they own, even for siblings. If the 529 account is owned by someone other than a parent, it's not reported as an asset on the FAFSA. However, distributions from that 529 account, when given to the beneficiary to pay for qualified education expenses, that would be considered income when the student is filling out the FAFSA 2 years after that distribution happens. So for example, for families who are completing the 2023-2024 FAFSA, right now, distributions from like a grandparent-owned plan or if an uncle-owned plan, distributions from that plan in 2021 is considered untaxed income. So it does have more of an impact on eligibility for sure, because that's going to be treated as student income, right? And we know how that's assessed right now. So this is one, I just make a plug, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but this is one of the really positive changes that are coming down the road for 529 plans. And the reason why we should talk to all people about opening an account, grandparents, if you haven't had those conversations recently. And then just, I'll also qualify this to say that this is how the legislation is expected to behave starting in for the 24-25 FAFSA, unless Congress changes the laws, which is always possible. So I just want to mention that little caveat. And then we can move on and talk about what is really my favorite slide ever when helping families understand the importance of saving. So this gives you two different families here, both with an AGI of $200,000, and the student, their income, as you can see from the assumption there, is $5,000, but zero assets for the student. The only difference between these two families is that the middle, or the second, the pie chart that you see there on the right, or the donut graph that you see on the right, this family has $100,000 in college savings compared to 0 on the left in college savings. And look at the difference in the expected family contribution. It's only going up by $5,640. So this is where you see that 5.64% come in, right? It's pretty clear when you do the numbers, when you run them through an EFC calculator, you can see how this formula works and why it makes the case why everyone should be saving as much as they possibly can to help meet higher education or other qualified education expenses as well. So again, what I mentioned before, it is absolutely not happening. If you have $100,000, the school isn't expecting that you're going to be able to turn that over, hand that right over to the school to help, pay for expenses. And so yes, there is an impact, but it's very, very minimal. Now, as a parent who's going to be sending a child to college in the next 5 years, which is terrifying. I'm doing the best that I can to save and save and save and save. And I guess the good news is that I know I'm going to have to report this, but I would much rather have that money set aside and be able to use it to help pay for college expenses and pay that college bill when the time comes. And I would ask folks, and I'd love you to throw into the chat panel, and I'll monitor it as I'm talking here. Let me know for the institutions that you work at right now, would this be a major impact to the financial aid award, right? So these two families here, would it significantly impact the EFC going from 41,893 to 47,533? Would it be a major impact at your institution? Just yes or no in the chat panel, real quick here. And while we're waiting for those to come in, I would also say too, that $100,000, so another case for savings, right? That $100,000 is probably not $100,000 out of pocket, right? So we're assuming that if you're amassing $100,000 in savings, that it's been a significant amount of time that you've been saving money aside, and you've benefited from tremendous growth likely at that point. So again, just another reason to save. And the truth is, unless you work at an institution that meets full need, an increase of $5,640 in the expected family contribution is probably not going to have a major impact, if any impact at all, on the financial aid award. Yeah, so no impact at all for in-state residents, for in-state institutions. That makes absolute sense. So you can use this example if you don't have an example already in your back pocket to say, that the next barbecue that you go to when the weather turns nice again, this is why you should be saving for college. All right, let's move on to the next slide. So let's pretend there have been years and years of saving, and now you have you have a high school senior, or actually your high school senior is ready to matriculate into college. You have full control on how to use those funds. So you, as the account owner, decide when and how to use them. You're also responsible, so really important, you're responsible for not taking out too much, right? Taking out a distribution that's going to exceed your qualified education expenses. And I'll run through an example and to show you generally how that calculation works. The trip up obviously is that if you take out a larger distribution than your qualified expenses, then you will owe a penalty, potentially owe a 10% penalty, plus you'll owe tax on those earnings. So it's really important that you do a little planning before the distributions begin to decide how that's going to work. And it's likely you'll want to wait until you get that financial aid award letter from the institution and even the final bill before you make those distinctions, which is likely happening anyway. I don't know too many people who would take a distribution before they know how much they need to pay. So let's say, for example, if you have saved 20,000 or even 25,000, which is close to the national average of amounts in college in 529 plans, you don't have to use the full amount for year one. You can decide to use a portion, just a portion for year one, another portion. You could divide it evenly over the 4 years if you wanted to. You could wait and you could take a full distribution. Let's say we're in a situation kind of like we're in right now, and you have a 529 college savings plan, and you want to see if the market climbs back a little bit before you start distributing those funds. You have the ability to do that. Now, when it's time to take the distribution, you also have a couple of options. You can send the money directly to the institution, which helps with bookkeeping, or you can take the distribution yourself as the account owner, or have it go to the beneficiary. And there can be some tax implications that may suggest you want to, if you're going to take the distribution yourself, have it come to you instead of the institution, you may want to have that go directly to the beneficiary. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But in order to qualify for tax-free distributions, of course, eventually you have to send that money to the institution or use it for another qualified education expense in order to have it count. Now, when you start taking distributions, the program administrator, so whoever's sending you your statements, they are going to send you a 1099-Q, which reports all of the distributions for that tax year. And then you're responsible for reporting to the IRS what your expenses are. And if your distribution is lower than your qualified education expenses, no tax is required, and you don't have to report that. Distributions are not going to be included as income, which ultimately increases your tax liability. So let's just talk a little bit about or run through an example really quick of how this works. So generally speaking, you shouldn't be taking a distribution that's larger than your expenses in the calendar year, which makes sense. If these are plans that are intended to be used for education expenses, you wouldn't be able to withdraw more than what you need to pay for those educational expenses and still expect to get a tax cut, right? So generally speaking, that's how it works. But let's just run through a quick example. Let's just say that your qualified education expenses are $20,000. So of course, that would include your tuition and fees. It would include books and related supplies. Or a computer. It would also include room and board if the student is over half time. Now, if the student is living off campus, you can still count room and board, but generally speaking, you're going to include the amount that the institution is including in their cost of attendance, or it really is the lower of the two amounts. So it wouldn't be exceeding, you can't claim more than what the institution would bill you if you were living on campus. But you can include those amounts, your off-campus living amounts, in as a qualified education expense. So let's say that those are that adds up to $20,000. Now, let's say that the student is lucky enough to get a $10,000 scholarship. Fantastic. So that essentially reduces your qualified education expenses by half. So now you can only take up to $10,000 in that same tax year in a distribution, tax and penalty free. But here's where some of the planning comes in. So let's also say that you're eligible for and you plan to take the American Opportunity Tax Credit, right? There's no double dipping when it comes to taxes. The IRS is really good about making sure that doesn't happen. So no double dipping on tax benefits. So if you are eligible for and take the American Opportunity Tax Credit, or AOTC, then you have to subtract from your qualified education expenses the amount that you're using to qualify of those expenses, the amount that you use to qualify for the AOTC. And the maximum that is $4,000. That's just the way that it works. So that $10,000 in qualified education expenses is really now only $6,000. And so distributions in that same tax year can be $6,000 and under. Now, if it's over $6,000, then what happens is the excess amount, the earnings portion of the excess amount, not the principal, but the earnings portion of that amount is subject to federal tax and federal income tax. And then also there is a 10% penalty on that. Where it gets a little bit more complicated, but to the benefit of the account owner, is that 10% penalty can be waived if the reason for the excess distribution is because of scholarships. So in this particular example, where the scholarship was $10,000 total, scholarships and grants all totaled up, was $10,000, with that 10% penalty would be likely waived. But sometimes when people hear tax liability and then they hear, a 10% penalty on top of that, they think this is going to be a really large number. But again, remember that this is not based on the principal or the total amount of the distribution. It's just on the growth portion of that excess that would be applied. One thing you want to caution parents, and this is especially true for expenses like books and related supplies that families are going to have outside of the tuition and fee bill, it's really important to keep accurate records, because while they're going to get a 1098-T from the institution, which shows all of the payment of all of these qualified expenses in a nice form, that doesn't happen with books and supplies. And so it's really, really important that they maintain these records. Now, I've heard that it's not likely that audits happen related to 529 distributions and tax penalties very often. But if in the event that happens, you need to make sure that you have appropriate paperwork and receipts to show where you spent those funds. And now this is the last bullet that I want to talk about. This is important from what I mentioned before. So whoever receives the funds, so if a family is taking a direct distribution, if it goes to the parent and there is excess, there's a tax penalty. If it goes to the parents are obligated to report that on their tax return, and that's going to potentially have a higher tax liability in general than if it were associated. They're going to be likely in a higher tax bracket than the dependent student. If the distribution is sent to the student, then they're responsible. And again, there's an excess, they're responsible for reporting that on their federal tax return. So this is where it's helpful to bring in a tax attorney, right? To kind of go through, or a financial advisor, to go through your own situation. Once you get the college bill, once you know what the tuition and fees and the students' required expenses are going to be, what that financial aid offer is going to look like, that's when you start figuring out, how are we going to start using these funds that we've set aside for years and years and years? What are we claiming for education tax credits? Where does it all fit in, and how do we lay this out so we don't pay any more taxes than we need or we want to? So moving on to the next slide, I want to talk about some of the things that, some of the changes that have recently been made to 529 qualified education expenses specifically. And then we'll get into some of the changes that are happening on the FAFSA slated for 24-25. So the recent-ish changes as part of the 2017 Tax Cut and Job Act. What's nice about these changes that we're going to go through here is it really did expand the usage of 529 funds, which is great, because all that does is provide more flexibility. And that's all families want when they're making investments decisions and they're deciding, do I put my money here or do I save here? They want flexibility for life's what ifs, right? Because you're planning for something that's happening years down the road, and it really is a what if. Retirement's not so much a what if, right? We're planning to retire, but whether or not the child's going to go to college, where they're going to go to college, all of those are what ifs, and families want flexibility when it comes to that. So these are all really, really great. In terms of the 2017 Tax Cut and Job Act, what families can now do is they can take tax-free withdrawals up to $10,000 per year for K through 12 expenses, right? An option that they have. I think a lot of families are continuing to save for college, plan to continue saving for college. You might not have a long runway to allow for growth if you're saving for K through 12 expenses, but think about using this as a benefit if, let's say, you have multiple children and child number one doesn't end up going to college for whatever reason. That just gives you more flexibility to use the money in other ways. Also, as part of this recent-ish legislation, account holders are allowed to transfer 529 assets to ABLE accounts. Those are tax advantage savings accounts for individuals with disabilities and their families. In 2019, as part of the Secure Act, families can use funds to pay for, and this is just a one-time expense, can take up to $10,000 of their 529 account tax-free to pay off student loans. So again, using the example that I gave before, let's say you have multiple children, the first child didn't end up going to school, or actually, let me give you a better example. The child did go to school, but they ended up getting a full scholarship. Fantastic. The full scholarship, they still needed to take out some student loans, though. You could use those funds to repay student loans, which is really nice and tax-free. Of course, you can always withdraw your funds at any time to use for any purpose, but you're going to be paying taxes on the earnings and a 10% penalty if they're not used for these qualified education expenses. And then the other change that they made as part of the Secure Act is that families can also use 529 assets to help pay for apprenticeships, which is nice as well. Again, just pointing to more flexibility within these plans. Next slide. 2020, the Consolidated Appropriations Act. This is the big change that I mentioned before. Now, again, I just want to caveat that this is the way that it's supposed to work, starting with the 2024-2025 FAFSA. So that would be any distributions paid on behalf of the student from a 529 plan that a parent didn't own. So again, going back to the grandparent or uncle or aunt or uncle example, if that distribution happened in 2022, no longer reported as income, as untaxed income on the student side. And again, factored much more heavily into the EFC formula. So with the SAI, the Student Aid Index that's expected to come, which I know everybody's thinking about, what does this mean? This is one of the really positive changes that's coming down the road. So this should encourage every grandparent uncle to set up 529 accounts. But again, things could possibly change. So it's really important to pay attention to what's happening in this space, so families are making the right decisions for themselves. And then I think we're on to questions. And so we have about 7 minutes left, and we're here to answer any questions that you may have about all of the nuances related to 529 plans and how to use those funds.
I'll just add too, as folks are thinking about questions, I think with what we're seeing with recent legislation and kind of where they've gone, even from where 529s have started, and this is something that was reiterated at the 529 conference, it's very, it's not common that you see certain investment vehicles just get more and more benefits, right? Like the 529s do, they just continue, hopefully, knock on wood, it keeps happening, to become more attractive, in terms of lower fees, more investment options, more usage and flexibility. So they're just a really, really strong option for families looking to save for college.
I have a good question. So on Joanne, when you were talking about the changes coming up, like with the FAFSA, so with the CSS profile, do we know how that's?
No
taking that
change.
into account?
Yeah, no, those were just the FAFSA changes. So just like it kind of works right now, right? They would be required to continue reporting. Yeah.
That's what I figured.
Yeah.
Full disclosure, I used to work at the College Board with the CSS profile.
Oh, yeah.
So
So you know a lot about that form.
I
The
do.
ins and outs
I
of
love
the
handouts
profile.
of institutional methodology myself.
And I believe in IM, it's still 5%, right? That like a parent asset for 529, any parent asset would be factored into that formula. So even lower rate than the FAFSA.
Yeah, it's between 3 and 5.
Between 3 and 5, yeah. We'll have to do a whole other session on the changes that are coming down the road to that. It's fascinating.
Yes, for sure. So
have,
are there
sorry,
other
did you have a
questions?
question? I have a question. I was going to type it, but I can't type that fast right now. So I often receive the question from families if it's better to use their 529 to pay for the full first year in one chunk or spread out over the 4 years, and wondering if you have advice on that. I have my own thoughts on it and what I've done, but I'm curious what you say.
Yeah, that great question. And and this is one of the times where I would say it's a good idea to talk to either a tax professional or
that's what I always say.
yeah, right. That's always the easiest
Yeah.
thing. But there really are some key considerations, right? Like one I mentioned, which is the market, right? If the market's down and you don't want to withdraw the funds given where they're, the performance where they're at right now, and you want to hold on to them to see what could happen in the next couple of years, that's one consideration. With the if a 529 account is owned by someone other than the parent, like a grandparent, when those distributions did in fact have a significant impact on the expected family contribution, waiting until like the junior year to take a distribution from those, because because the 2-year look back on income, it wouldn't be included anywhere, right? So, but again, that's slated to change, right? So that would no longer be a factor. And then I guess my question would be, what are your other plans to meet college expenses, right? So if you have to borrow, and you're going to start, and it, depending on the type of loan, if interest starts accruing, from the moment that is distributed to the student's account, then, you're going to have to factor in interest that's being applied to the principal balance of that loan, which is an important financial consideration too, right? Do we start borrowing now or do we start borrowing later? And again, if borrowing is in the picture, but if borrowing doesn't need to happen, or if the student can get away with only taking out subsidized loans, and a payment plan, right, is the intention for meeting those expenses, then that's less of a factor. But because of all of those nuances, and also considering if the family is eligible for and plans to take the American Opportunity Tax Credit or Lifetime Learning Credit, you want to make sure that you're not taking more than that distribution would allow, and otherwise you're creating a taxable event.
Thank you.
But I think telling people to talk to a financial advisor is,
that's always the safest.
It's always the safest. It's always the safest.
Do we have any other questions? All right. Well, I want to thank Joann and Jonathan so much for this. I don't know if I just closed out the sharing. I apologize if I did. But their email addresses were up there. I'm sure they would welcome. Well, maybe welcome is a strong word, but they'll answer your questions. So thank you
Absolutely.
very much. I think Kat, did you share those other slides already about our upcoming events?
I did. I shared them in the beginning. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
And
Sorry.
we'll send that out with the recording. How's that sound?
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
everyone.
Kat. Thank you,
Appreciate it.
Julia.
You.
Bye-bye.
Great. Thank you.
Bye.